There are moments in history when a people have nothing left to protect themselves except their voice. When their land is taken, their names rewritten, their stories burned, and their identities scattered. The only thing still standing is the sound of their own words. And for Africans carried into foreign lands, words became more than communication, they became shields. Words were their armor, their refuge, their inheritance. The quiet fortress they built inside themselves when the outside world refused to give them protection. When we think about the journey of African people across continents through forced migration, through bondage, through displacement, through survival, we often look at the physical strength that kept them alive. But behind that strength was something even more powerful, the way they used speech to protect their culture when nothing else could. They learned quickly that if the world could not take away their voice, it could never truly own their spirit. And so they spoke carefully, cleverly, rhythmically. They wrapped meaning inside metaphor. They hid identity inside song. They passed wisdom through whispers, coded language, playful tones, and storytelling that outsiders could not understand. Their speech became a protective layer that shielded the memories of home, preserving what could not be written down, what could not be openly taught, what could not be publicly celebrated. Even in the darkest conditions, they kept alive the rhythm of their answers through the way they communicated. Every sentence became a piece of culture. Every phrase carried a lineage. Every story became a seed planted for the next generation. When people are stripped of everything, their voice becomes the last line of defense, and Africans mastered the art of survival through sound. Their languages carried the blueprint of entire civilizations. Mathematics hidden in tonal patterns. Ethics encoded in proverbs, astronomy wrapped in folklore, healing knowledge preserved in chants. These weren't just words, they were cultural technology. When they spoke, they were transmitting memory. When they sang, they were recording history. When they whispered in languages foreign masters could not decipher, they were keeping their identity alive under the very nose of oppression. And even when forced to learn new tongues, they rewrote those languages with African structure, African rhythm, African soul. They bent new words into familiar shapes. They carved their presence into unfamiliar syllables. They made sure that even in a foreign land, foreign speech could not silence the African root inside it. That is why today, in places thousands of miles from the motherland, you still hear Africa inside the way people speak. You hear it in the Caribbean cadence. You hear it in the African American tone. You hear it in the Brazilian flow. You hear it in the Haitian lilt. You hear it in the Afro-Latino slang that carries the same spark that once protected entire community. And if you listen carefully, you realize that African speech didn't just survive the journey, it transformed every land it touched. Language is one of the most powerful forms of resistance ever created. It allows a people to preserve themselves even when circumstances try to erase. It becomes a shield not just for individuals but for entire generations. Africans in foreign lands understood that if they kept their speech alive, they could keep their identity alive. They used language as a map to find each other, as a code to pass information, as a tool to negotiate freedom, as a quiet rebellion when rebellion had consequences. Even when their original languages were taken, the instinct for coded survival remained. That instinct shaped new dialects, Creole languages, Pidgins, African American English, Jamaican Patois, Garifuna, Sango, Cape Verdean Criollo. These did not emerge from broken speech. They grew from genius. They were born from people who refused to let their tongues die. They were created by those who looked at a new environment, a new system, a new oppression, and said, "We will speak in a way that keeps us alive." And in that moment, African speech became a living archive. Even without books, they passed on medical knowledge, moral guidance, agricultural wisdom, spiritual philosophies, and community laws through their voices. Their languages traveled across borders and seas and centuries because people understood that to speak is to survive. And generation after generation used the same shield to protect what the world tried to scatter. What makes this even more extraordinary is that this protective speech did more than preserve the past. It shaped the future. African ways of speaking influenced music genres, cultural movements, global slang, and even political language. When Africans used words to lift each other, to encourage one another, to resist silently, they weren't only protecting themselves, they were planting seeds of global influence. Look at the way African American speech patterns have shaped modern entertainment. Look at how Afro-Caribbean rhythm shaped global music. Look at how African storytelling influenced film, literature, poetry. Look at how African cadence finds its way into motivational speaking, into leadership communication, into community building worldwide. What started as survival became power. What started as a shield became a spotlight. What once protected culture now spreads culture, and the world echoes with what was once whispered only in hidden corners. This is why understanding the value of African speech is not just about honoring the past, it is about recognizing your own voice. You come from a people who understood the power of words long before the world acknowledged it. You come from a people who used speech to teach, to protect, to strengthen, to unite. And whether you realize it or not, that inheritance is inside you. The way you speak carries the strength of ancestors who refused to be silenced. The tone you use carries the rhythm of those who survived storms. The creativity in your language carries the same brilliance that helped generations protect themselves. When you speak, you are holding a shield crafted by history, shaped by resilience, and sharpened by hope. Your voice is not ordinary. You carry the DNA of people who turned language into protection. You carry the legacy of those who understood that silence is surrender but speech is survival. So when you use your words today, whether you speak in English, Patois, Yoruba, Creole, Igbo, Swahili, French, or any blend created across the diaspora, remember that you are continuing a tradition that kept millions alive. Use your words with purpose. Use them to build, not break. Use them to heal, not harm. Use them to connect, not divide. Use them to reclaim identity, not hide it. Your speech is your heritage. Your tone is your birthright. Your voice is your shield. When the world tries to define you, let your words correct the narrative. When people underestimate you, let your voice remind them that your lineage is carved from greatness. When challenges rise, let your speech lift you above them. When doubt whispers, let your language speak power louder than fear. And never forget this truth. African speech did not merely survive foreign lands, it mastered them. It grew stronger, it grew deeper, it grew wiser. It took the shape of every environment and reshaped that environment in return. Everywhere Africans went, their voice became influence, their rhythm became culture, their metaphors became wisdom for future generations, and their speech, once used as a shield against oppression, became a gift to the entire world. You carry that gift today, so speak boldly. Speak proudly, speak with purpose. You are the descendant of a people whose words saved entire cultures. Let your voice continue the journey they began. Let your speech protect what must be preserved. Let it shape the world the way their voices shaped survival. Because when you speak with the strength of where you come from, nothing can silence the truth that lives inside you. You are the continuation of a shield made of language, memory, resilience, and unbreakable identity, and every word you speak is proof that everything they tried to erase still lives, still braves, and still rises through you. Even when Africans were taken far from their homelands and scattered across continents, language followed them like a quiet shadow that could not be separated from their spirit. Their words were more than sounds. They were memories, pieces of identity, and living proof that no distance or hardship could fully erase where they came from. Every phrase carried the weight of home. Every rhythm echoed generations, and every proverb held the wisdom of entire civilizations. Even when the world around them tried to silence their voices or reshape their identities, their speech became a hidden bridge that connected who they were with who they were becoming. Language moved with them in whispers, in coded songs, in names that carried meaning deeper than the ear could hear, and in expressions that only those who shared the same roots could truly understand. It preserved dignity in moments meant to break them. It quietly resisted every attempt to strip away identity. As their journeys continued across oceans and into foreign lands that did not welcome them, their speech took on an even more powerful role. When they were forbidden from speaking their native tongues openly, they found new ways to keep those languages alive through chants disguised as work songs, through rhythms that held hidden messages, and through storytelling passed down in secret moments. Even when the original languages began to blend with new ones, that fusion itself became a shield, a sign of adaptation without surrender. African words shaped the languages of the Caribbean, the Americas, and beyond. slipping into everyday speech, becoming part of new dialects, and influencing the cultural heartbeat of entire regions. In the way people prayed, sang, joked, greeted each other, and told their stories, the African tongue lived on. This linguistic resilience became one of the greatest acts of cultural survival in history. When people lose their land, traditions, and freedom, the last thing they cling to is language. It becomes a reminder that identity is not defined by where you stand, but by what you carry inside you. African communities used speech to protect their memories, to pass on values to their children, and to build unity among strangers who suddenly found themselves forming new families in unfamiliar places. Even when they could not write, they remembered. Even when they could not speak openly, they encoded messages in tone, rhythm, and gesture. Even when their language evolved into something new, its African soul remained untouched. Over time, these linguistic threads began shaping cultures across the world. In the Caribbean, you can hear African cadence in everyday conversation. In Brazil, African languages influenced the way people sing, dance, cook, and worship. In North America, African American vernacular English carries structure, rhythm, and expression that trace directly back to African speech patterns. Words like okay, gumbo, banjo, yam, and many others have African roots that quietly entered global vocabulary. This influence shows that even in displacement, language has the power to plant seeds that grow for generations. What began as survival became transformation. African language was not only preserved, it reshaped the world around. It gave birth to new forms of communication, new styles of music, new expressions of emotion, and new ways of building community. It protected the values of respect, unity, resilience, and wisdom that have always been central to African society. It carried stories of ancestors, reminding each generation that identity is not something that can be stolen. It is something that breathes through the words we speak and the stories we choose to keep alive. Today, when we listen closely, we can still hear those ancient rhythms. In the way people across the diaspora talk with passion, move with expression, and tell stories with depth, the spirit of African speech remains alive. It has survived oppression, migration, and cultural blending, proving that language is not just communication, it is a shield, a memory, and a lifeline connecting millions of people across time and space. African people carried more than their bodies across oceans. They carried a memory system built through centuries of spoken tradition, and this became one of the strongest shields of identity in foreign lands. Even when their environment changed, when their names were altered, and when the world around them attempted to reshape their existence, the spoken word became the one thing they guarded with their lives. Storytelling was not entertainment for them, it was survival. It was how they preserved the meaning of who they were long before written records existed. They used it to pass on the history of their ancestors, the lessons from their communities, and the wisdom that guided their daily lives. In moments when everything seemed uncertain, their words allowed them to hold on to something permanent, something rooted in the core of their being. When they told stories, they were not just recounting events, they were protecting the soul of a people. And in foreign lands, where cultures collided and identities were threatened, this spoken tradition became the anchor that kept them from drifting into forgetfulness. It kept their values alive even when their circumstances tried to silence them. Every chant carried a message. Every proverb held a reminder. Every rhythm in their voice acted as a bridge between the world they lost and the world they were forced to build. When they gathered in small groups and told stories under the night sky or whispered them in hidden corners, they were doing more than speaking. They were defending the history of entire civilizations. Their oral tradition had the power to turn memory into armor. Even when they were not allowed to speak their native languages openly, they kept them alive through tone, melody, and coded expressions that outsiders did not understand. A song sung in the fields might sound ordinary to someone who didn't know better, but to those who shared the same roots, it was a reminder of home, a reminder of identity, a reminder that they were connected to something larger than themselves. These spoken codes protected their dignity at a time when others tried to strip it away. Names were another powerful shield. Many Africans in foreign lands gave their children names that carried hidden meanings, preserving their cultural values even as the world around them changed. A name might represent strength, promise, hope, or ancestry. It might be shortened, disguised, or blended into a new language, but its essence remained untouched. Through naming, they ensured that each new generation inherited a piece of their story. Their spoken tradition allowed them to protect not only the memory of where they came from, but also the promise of where they were going. Language became the seed that allowed their culture to grow in places that were never meant to welcome it. And when new dialects were born, whether in the Caribbean, the Americas, or Brazil, these blended languages carried the soul of Africa within them. Even when the original words transformed, the rhythm, structure, and feeling remained deeply connected to African speech patterns. This evolution was not a sign of loss, it was a sign of resilience. It showed that African culture did not disappear in foreign lands. It adapted, survived, and reshaped the world around it. Every dialect influenced by African language became a reminder that identity cannot be erased, it only evolves. These new forms of speech helped community communicate in ways that outsiders could not fully understand, giving them a private space in a world that often denied them freedom. Storytelling among Africans in foreign lands also played a role in building unity. People from different ethnic groups who might not have interacted back home found themselves forming new bonds through shared struggle. Their spoken traditions became the foundation of these new relations. They combined stories, mixed proverbs, blended chants, and created new narratives that reflected their present reality and their collective hope. The spoken word became a tool for healing, a tool for belonging, and a tool for building a future that honored their past. In the absence of written records, oral tradition allowed them to maintain a sense of direction. Without it, many would have lost the thread of who they were, but through it, they kept walking forward with purpose. In homes built from unfamiliar materials, in fields where their hands worked from sunrise to sunset, and in communities where uncertainty surrounded them, spoken tradition gave African people the courage to keep going. A simple story could remind a child of the strength of their ancestors. A proverb shared by an elder could guide an entire community. A chant sung at night could calm the heart and restore hope. Their words carried power because they were rooted in centuries of resilience. They did not need libraries to preserve their identity. They had the living libraries of their voices. This powerful tradition shaped the future as well. As generations passed, African speech influenced music, literature, conversation styles, leadership structures, and even the way people expressed emotion. It shaped cultures far beyond the continent. The world today speaks with the echoes of African languages, sometimes without even realizing it. And every time those echoes appear, they remind us that identity is stronger than displacement, stronger than oppression, and stronger than time itself. Speech is not just communication for African people, it is a vessel carrying memory, strength, and truth across oceans and generations. And in foreign lands where everything tried to transform them, their words became their shield, a force so powerful that it protected and preserved their culture long enough for future generations to recover, rediscover, and reclaim. African words have traveled farther than ships, crossed more borders than armies, and left deeper marks on humanity than many realize, shaping entire cultures across continents in ways that history books often overlook. When African people were scattered across the world through forced migration and displacement, they did not only carry their bodies, they carried their linguistic fingerprints, tones, rhythms, structures, and expressions that became invisible threads weaving themselves into new societies. These were not just words, they were cultural signatures, pieces of identity disguised in everyday speech. In the Caribbean, for example, entire dialects blossomed from African linguistic roots. The cadence, the musicality, the emphasis patterns, the call and response style of communication. These were the living reflections of African languages adapting to new realities. Even when colonial powers tried to erase African speech, it reappeared in new forms, reshaped but never destroyed, living on in the chants of workers and the lullabies of mothers, in the coded messages shared among people who refused to let their identity be silenced. In Jamaica, Trinidad, Haiti, Barbados, and across the islands, African vocabulary blended with European and indigenous words to create Creole languages that carried the strength of multiple worlds but the soul of Africa. You hear it in greetings, in jokes, in storytelling, and music, and in the natural rhythm of everyday conversation. In North America, the impact was just as powerful. African speech patterns influenced the formation of African American Vernacular English, a dialect that has become one of the most influential language forms in the world today through music, culture, entertainment, and storytelling. Its sentence structure, melodic tone, and figurative expressions all echo African linguistic traditions that traveled silently across oceans. What many call slang today is actually the preserved memory of African languages, reshaped through generations but carrying the same creative energy that once filled African villages with storytelling, proverbs, and communal wisdom. These speech patterns became tools of unity, identity, and even resistance. They allowed enslaved Africans to communicate in ways that their oppressors could not understand, preserving dignity and strengthening community ties. The power of African language can be felt in jazz, blues, gospel, hip-hop, and spoken word poetry, where rhythm and repetition mirror the oral traditions of West and Central Africa. In South America and Brazil, the connection is even deeper. Yoruba, Kikongo, and Igbo vocabularies seeped into Portuguese-based creoles and everyday expressions. In Brazil, you cannot speak about religion, food, celebrations, or music without encountering African words. The very names of dances like samba, the terminology used in capoeira, and the vocabulary of spiritual traditions carry African origins. These words did not simply survive, they became the foundation for new cultural identity. African languages influenced the way communities expressed emotions, celebrated victories, and mourned losses. They shaped how people cooked, how they greeted one another, how they raised children, and how they sang songs that traveled from one generation to the next. Through these languages, African people rebuilt the emotional and cultural worlds they lost when they were taken from their homeland. Across the diaspora, African tones became cultural DNA. Even when the original words changed, the intonation remained. The high-low musical pitch found in Yoruba, the clipped consonants of Igbo, the rhythmic pattern of Wolof, the energetic pacing of Bantu languages, all became part of how millions speak around the world today. These tones shape the humor, storytelling, and music of entire nations. Call and response, an ancient African communication style, became the foundation of everything from church services in the Americas to carnival music to children's games sung in playgrounds. The African way of speaking became a blend of poetry, rhythm, and resilience wrapped into communication that carried strength even when silence was demanded of them. Even the foods people eat today hold linguistic fingerprints from Africa. Words like okra, gumbo, banjo, goober, and dozens more came directly from African languages. Every time someone uses those words without knowing their origin, they are unknowingly honoring centuries of African linguistic influence. In rituals, celebrations, and festivals across the Americas, African terms describe clothing, dance, food, and spiritual concepts that have become essential parts of local culture. These languages also shaped identity in subtle ways through nicknames, through proverbs passed down privately within families, through rhythmic patterns and storytelling that children learned before they even learned to walk. African words became shields, but they also became seeds planted in foreign soils, sprouting into new languages and new cultures that carry African identity even today. The resilience of these words proves that culture is not erased by distance and identity is not erased by force. African languages have shaped music industries, influenced global fashion, transformed entertainment, and added color to modern communication all over the world. Their impact is not small, hidden, or accidental. It is vast, powerful, and alive, echoing through generations that may not even know where their expressions come from. And the most extraordinary truth is that these African linguistic influences did not weaken as time passed. They grew stronger, more widespread, and more celebrated. They became proof that even when people lose everything, home, land, freedom, their voice can carry their identity farther than any bound. African words became the undefeated guardians of culture, weaving themselves into the world so deeply that humanity today speaks with the rhythm of Africa, whether it realizes it or not.